John Pike and myself, we're going to recognize an individual who has spent a lot of time with all of us. Every one of us has probably been touched by his expertise and his leadership. For the last 30 years, he's been at this convention and has spoken. Now the university has hired 3 young guns. They're coming in and they're going to be the guys that are going to make the recommendations to us. Emerson, would you please come up here? Emerson's not, he's retired from university, but he's not retiring from working. He's going to continue to help IFCA and help John and I continue our work too. But we're all getting a little bit older, and we welcome the 3 young guys that are coming into the university and to help with the nitrogen, the fertilizer recommendations, and those kind of things. Working with Emerson this won't be a roast, Emerson. This is all positive. The last, I don't know, 20 years that I've worked with Emerson on field research and stuff, I felt like I was his student. I was constantly learning from Emerson on how to do the projects, do them better, how to engage the farmers and those kind of things. So it's been very important to me to be able to be his student over the last 20 years. John, do you talk about your experiences with... No, I'll hold this one. You just go with that one.
I've never double mic'd it before, but I started in the fertilizer business as my first job in Piatt County in 1990, and I've listened to Emerson talk at a lot of meetings, being close to Champaign, and moved on. I've worked in extension for a number of years, and then switched to the crop sciences department, where I ran the Dixon Springs experiment station for a few years, where Emerson was my boss. And I have really enjoyed the time, the things that I've learned from Emerson, and all of the interactions that we've had from him. And I really think that since 1990, it's been, what, 35 years? I think he's really catching on to this professor deal. So there's a future in that. But I thank Emerson for all of his help and support through the years, and it's been a pleasure to be involved with him. Not just to work with him, but I think to know him as a friend, because he stands up here and he talks about graphs and different things, but he's really a super guy, and to be able to know him a little bit deeper than the PowerPoint presentation has really been a pleasure.
Emerson, we've got a plaque for you, and I also got gift certificates to 2 of my favorite restaurants in Champaign.
Wow, Casey's gift certificates.
Use that one. This one is.
So the award just says, with our great appreciation, Dr. Emerson Nafziger, thank you for all your unwavering commitment, hard work, and dedication to IFCA and all the farmers. We're grateful for your unwavering loyalty and passion, positive impact for the agri-retail industry. So let's give it a nice round of applause to Emerson Nafziger.
Got a couple words to say.
I have a couple of words to say. Thanks very much. It's been really good. I'm so used to coming to Peoria, that my car goes here automatically every January. But it's a great. Illinois is the state to be doing what I spent my career doing, and this group is part of the reason for that. A lot of interest. You know, it's easy to get lost in the sort of academic things, but this is where the real business, the real industry takes place. So I appreciate all the support that I've had. I think this is my official retirement from showing up here, but I might do it another time or two. I'm still interested and active. This is my year when I turn 3/4 of a century old, so I probably won't be doing it too much longer, but it's been good. Illinois is, my adopted state, but I've lived here more than over half my life, and wouldn't want to be anywhere else. Thanks.
Thank you, Emerson.
Thank you, Emerson, very much.
Emerson, when did you get started helping all these fertilizer folks?
Well, I was I was hired at the university to be the grain crop agronomist. And we had, Bob Haft was our soil fertility person, and I had very little to do directly with that. But you aren't working with corn production very long before you say, hey, nitrogen's really important and it interacts with everything else. And I was always aware of, you know, how farmers had got their recommendations for nitrogen. And from my youth, I was aware that we were using way more nitrogen than the yields of the crop would have suggested was necessary. But what's really changed is the hybrids, and they're so much better at doing what they do. Root systems are better, they're more intact, the breeders pay more attention to these. Good breeding means good roots. Breeding for yield means good roots. And so what we started to notice in the late 90s was that the recommendation, which was based on yield, expected yield, 1.2 times the expected yield, and then you'd subtract 40 pounds if soybean was the previous crop. And farmers were using that, and they were very comfortable with it. It's a comforting thing because it says, well, in the 90s, you know, my yield was 170, but, you know, I think 190 makes sense, and let's shoot for 190, and then you multiply that out, and you'd end up using, you know, a pretty good amount of fertilizer for the yield that there was going to be. We started to notice two things. One is, in the higher productive soils, the nitrogen rate done with the yield expectation was actually higher than our trials showed that we needed. And in southern Illinois, mostly southern Illinois, but in areas with less organic matter and lower yield potential, more drought prone and so on, that recommended rate based on the expected yield was actually too low. So we had this idea that the idea is sound that a higher yielding crop needs more nitrogen. It has to take up more. But what it doesn't take into account is that there's always some nitrogen coming from the soil. And the higher organic matter, central Illinois, northern Illinois, prairie soils with 3.5% organic matter have a lot more nitrogen to offer than a Sisney silt loam in Vandalia area that, you know, is a very productive soil if you get good weather for it, but it doesn't have the capability of producing that amount of nitrogen. So that was one of the problems, is that it didn't really account for other factors like that. And it was very easy for farmers to get the idea, you know, if this crop needs 150 pounds of nitrogen, I have to put that much on because it's not going to, it all depends on me and what I put on, you know. And so that's one thing that our research started to show, that, wait a minute, this crop is having a pretty decent yield before you go out there with fertilizer. And then that has just continued to grow. And as the crop has gotten better at yielding and taking up nutrients and water, better root systems and so on, that's just increased in size. And we have lots of data now, and if you spill it out across a page, it says, you know, the amount of nitrogen this crop needed in fertilizer wasn't very closely correlated to its actual yield. I like to talk about ones we've had the last couple of years at one of our sites. We've had yields of 240 to 250 without any nitrogen fertilizer. You say, well, that's not even possible. Oh, yes, it is. These 3.5% organic matter to 10 or 12 inches deep is a lot of nitrogen. Tons, literally tons per acre. Only a 2 or maybe 3% become available in a really good year. And in a year when it's dry, really dry, or too wet early, that could be maybe only 1% of that fertilizer. So, but certainly we've come to understand that about half of the nitrogen that our crop needs through central Illinois comes from the soil, and the other half is what we put on as fertilizer. So we like to talk about fertilizer use efficiency and the yield we get for each pound of nitrogen used and so on. That's all well and good, but we always need to keep in mind, you know, it had some nitrogen there to start with. Our fertilizer nitrogen is really only supplementing what the soil is going to give that crop. How do we know how much the soil gives? Well, we do nitrogen trials and we use a rate of 0. We like to use a rate of 0. And the rate of the yield at 0 nitrogen, if we use the simple conversion I use, which is 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel of yield, if you get 120 bushel yields without nitrogen fertilizer, that soil has produced about 120 pounds. And on average, if we have a average yield of 220 bushel within our nitrogen trials across a year, it's generally the fact that about 100, 110 of that came from the soil. In other words, that was the yield with 0 nitrogen. So I'm really encouraged when I hear talk about the fertilizer survey and, you know, the average for the state that we just heard reported was a little under 200 pounds of nitrogen. If farmers were using with the yields they're getting now, and this last 2 years, it has not been, or 3 years, it hasn't been unusual to hear farmers say 280, 290, 300 bushel yields for a field. These are things in, you know, 40 years ago we would have thought, well, that's never going to happen because it seemed impossible. I'm of the age that I remember the 200 bushel clubs, you know, and when you got 200 bushel, you really had something. Well, when you have 200 bushel now, we call it a crop failure, but back then it was a real accomplishment. And I'm encouraged because if farmers said, well, if I'm going to get 300, you know, or let's say 275 bushel corn, I surely have to use more than 200 pounds of nitrogen, and the fact is we don't. It so happens that the conditions, soil, weather, conditions that are good for high yields tend to be good for this supply of nitrogen from the soil, that mineralization production of nitrogen. It's a microbial process, so happy microbes make for good nitrogen supply and tend to make for good yields as well. And that's what we've been seeing these last few years. So I'm really encouraged that it can have, you know, the whole idea of this MRTN, this sort of data-based yield nitrogen rate guidelines that we've produced for the last, going on 20 years now. I'm really encouraged that you know, it has producers seeing the possibility. You know, the truth of the matter is in very few of our fields is nitrogen rate the limiting factor. And I've asked farmer groups, I said, how many have you seen a general nitrogen deficiency across your field? And very few people have seen if we have standing water early in the season, then we see yellow corn. And if it stands long enough, it can stay yellow and not yield anything. But in good years, when we get some dry weather in June, and we've had that the last 3 years, and we really learned to treasure that now, because no standing water means a good environment for roots to develop and grow, and a good environment for nitrogen. And so that's how we explain this, you know, high yields or low yields. Sometimes low yields need more nitrogen than high yields, and that's usually because of those root conditions that just weren't ideal for either yield or for the nitrogen supply.
So you've been working with IFCA and its legacy organizations since the, mid-90s then? So that's 30 plus years.
Our my direct involvement with IFCA really started back in the 2013, 2014 area, Dan Schaefer was running these on-farm trials, and he got the little design from me. There was nothing real, complicated about that. We had done some on-farm nitrogen trials, first with the state of Illinois Department of Ag, actually, back in the early 2000s. And so certainly for all of that time, more than 25 years, or about 25 years, I've been involved in this, more of a regular on-farm trial, sets of trials that farmers ran, and then Dan took over and ran these. We had large numbers of them 8 to 10 years ago, and the number is declining now, but we have a database in Illinois that would be the envy of any state. And there now Iowa and Ohio has done some of that, trying to sort of duplicate what we've done here, and we really value that, and I think it's one of the biggest contributions. And it's a little unusual for a fertilizer chemical association. Simply they're a trade organization. They represent the retailers. Some retailers may say, well, we need to sell more nitrogen, not less. But I think, and one reason I appreciate being here and interacting with people here is that there's a recognition, that nitrogen is seen by the general public as a pollutant, certainly a potential one, and we can say, well, the crop needs it, we just have to use it. But I've been in places in the world where nitrogen is subsidized and just way too much is used. And I'm glad we're here, where I know that it's a costly input, but people are always getting better at using it to its maximum benefit and not trying to reduce the amount that goes down the river.
I think as someone who's been involved in extension for your career, teaching farmers, it seems like the IFCA folks, the ag retailers, they've kind of been an extension of you in carrying your message to their customers.
Well, I think that's been somewhat true. I don't know what they all do. But I think there's the fact that an organization like the university and IFCA is one that people tend to listen to, and there's a lot of people to listen to these days, and the marketers are certainly some of them, and some of that's good, and some of it probably isn't, proven to be great enhancers of income and sustainability. But yes, I think that this is what we work for, and we do, in some cases like this, we probably do things that, a group of fertilizer retailers may not come up with the idea that let's go prove that we don't need as much nitrogen as we're selling. And I'm encouraged when I see the reasonableness of this, and if we can get a handle on this, and before we have the European style, if you would, limitations on what we use, if we act on our own, I think that's just going to be better for everyone. We don't need regulation if we can get these things in a good zone on our own beforehand and do it voluntarily. And I think we're getting there.
Congratulations to you on a great career, the great relationship with IFCA, and with that recognition that they gave you today.
Thank you.